Hi, so today I'm sitting here with Adam Lehman, and we are talking about holograms and using the idea of a hologram and a holographic model to change the way that we work with specialized kinesiology. And for anyone who's not familiar with Adam's work, he designed the Holographic Touch for Health classes and has been spending a lot of his time over the last, I don't even know how many years, talking about it in conferences. And what was that?
30 years.
30 years.
Well, for how stuff over, 25 years.
Right. So I figured if we was going to talk about this kind of idea with anybody, it should be with Adam. So thank you for agreeing to talk with me about this today. I was wondering if, to start with, you could explain briefly how holograms are actually created and then how that idea would reflect in something like Touch for Health.
Well, sure. Before I do that, I'd like to preface it with something else, actually, and that is that, the holographic model is based on a concept of the holographic universe, really, and that, the whole universe we live in is a hologram. And from a kinesiology perspective, Richard Utt, who was the founder of applied physiology, which I spent the last 20 plus years being an instructor of, he's the person who's really brought that model into kinesiology in a way that nobody else did, and that I've never still seen anybody else do, other than people borrowing that concept. So, and what the holographic aspect is just based on that we live in a three-dimensional universe, and we see in three dimensions, we hear in three dimensions, and yet most of the work we do, it tends to be a little more two-dimensional in nature. So what this allowed for is to work in a three-dimensional construct that's more consistent with the nature of the universe we live in. So what that ultimately means, holograms didn't exist until lasers were invented. And a laser is simply coherent light, and meaning that it's very well organized. And that's what allows a laser beam to go such long distances and maintain such a tight focus. And what was discovered was that by taking a laser beam and splitting it into two, and one of those beams going to a particular object that you wanted to take a holographic picture of, and the other beam went directly to the plate that was the holographic film. So you have one beam going to an object, bouncing off of it, going to the film, the other beam just going directly to the film and colliding there. And that collision creates something called an interference pattern. And so an interference pattern on a holographic plate, what it looks like if you just look at it in normal light, is that it looks like the surface of the moon. It's just a kind of a grayish, swirly pattern of things. And one way to think of an interference pattern is if you were sitting by a pond on a nice, beautiful day, and it's calm, and there's very still water on the pond, and you pick up a pebble and you toss it out into the middle of the pond, and it hits the water, and it just creates that nice ring that just comes out, and it keeps going and going and going until it hits the shore. But if you take a handful of pebbles and you toss them out, they all go to slightly different locations, they all start creating their own rings. But then the rings start colliding with each other and creating different, more complex wave patterns as they do that. And that's what an interference pattern is. And that's what happens when these two beams collide. One with the information of having bounced off the object that you're taking the picture of, and the other just going directly there. So then when you take that plate and you shine a laser beam on it again, up pops this three-dimensional representation of the image that you took a picture of. and you can kind of walk around it, and walk around the sides and look underneath it, and it's a full three-dimensional representation of that, which is very different than taking a normal photograph, where you're just looking at a couple of people from one end. If you turn it around, you're looking at the back of a piece of paper. So you get a lot more detail and richness of, you know, what the object you've taken a picture of actually is.
Okay.
So that's how you make the hologram. And the real key aspect of that is that you're dealing with these two beams colliding, and that's what forms the three-dimensional picture. And it's very similar to how we see. So, you know, I know you've seen me show this in any number of demonstrations where I have everybody kind of create a little triangle and look through, you know, with look at a particular object that I put up on a screen, and they look at that, and then I have them close one eye. And most people, but not everybody, most people will automatically close the eye that lets them continue to see that object. But then when they, without moving, switch eyes, they notice that the other eye, they no longer see the object anymore, because that eye is looking over off to the side and creating that's like the beam that's, you know, not going to the object. And it's the combination of all this information being translated by your brain that allows us to see depth and create that three-dimensional experience.
Right.
So it's all about relationships.
Well, isn't everything really? Okay.
Well, exactly. That's it. That's exactly it. That's the nature of the holographic universe we live in, because that's what it's all about. We can only perceive things because we are in relationship to it. And so everything is in relation to everything else. And that's what's required to have the existence that we perceive.
That starts getting close to quantum physics, role of the observer in changing the reality around us kind of stuff there. Yeah.
It's all the same, absolutely.
Okay.
Everything, all of those concepts are very much intertwined.
So how does this this phenomenon that you've just described of being able to use, you know, these two focused bits of energy in order to create something different and three-dimensional, how does that apply to the Touch for Health model or to specialized kinesiology in general?
Well, what Richard figured out, and I won't go into the whole history of how that happened, but the bottom line is that, you know, in normal Touch for Health or any number of other kinesiologies, you know, you find one piece of information in sort of the basic approach. You know, in Touch for Health, you test a muscle, it goes off, you rub a point, you test it again, you see if it made a change, and if it did, you go on to the next muscle, and you sort of go in that one by one scenario. And a muscle relates to an organ, the meridian, and the muscle itself, obviously. And that's kind of a two-dimensional approach. And so, and there was a type of kinesiology called holographic kinesiology. I don't know whatever happened to that, but it did exist for a while. But it basically was just saying we live in a holographic universe, and so, you know, what we do is dependent on the nature of the holographic universe we live in. And so that's true of any healing art and everything we do. The genius of what Richard put together is that he used that concept of how you make a hologram and turned it into a way, not just of taking advantage of the holographic nature of the universe for doing the healing and balancing part of the work we do, but using the concepts of a hologram as a means of how to actually assess imbalances in the body. And so the difference there is you never work on just a single meridian. You're always working on a relationship between two meridians. So rather than just go for a muscle, if we use the alarm points, we find an initial meridian called an object meridian. Well, that's equivalent to the beam that goes to the object you're taking a picture of. And then we look for a reference meridian that's in relation to that object meridian, similar to your eye looking off to the side, or that second beam simply going to the plate and colliding there. And that collision represents a whole lot of information, massive amounts of information. And so that by looking at that relationship, we are creating a three-dimensional construct that then when we do our balancing, we balance that relationship. So, so what? What's the big deal about that? Well, it is a big deal because, for one thing, when in a hologram has massive amounts more data in it as a result of these two lasers colliding the way they do. To create a three-dimensional image is just a huge amount more data than simply looking flat at, a picture of a couple of people. And so, but not only is it more data, there's another really intriguing property about that, and that is that if I take a normal photograph and I cut it in half, and I'm looking at two people, and I cut it in half, now I have one person and I have the other person. And if I cut it across, now I have the tops of their heads and the bottom of the heads. And if I keep cutting those, eventually I have no idea who these people are anymore. I'd have to create a whole puzzle and tape them all back together again. If I take a holographic plate and I cut it in half and as many times as I want, and I take one little piece of that and shine the laser on it, then I still get the whole picture. The whole picture pops up. It's not as clear, it's not as defined, it might be a little fuzzy, but it's all there and it's recognizable. So every piece contains the whole, and that's a key part of that. So when I'm balancing somebody and I'm looking at the relationship between two meridians, I'm getting a huge amount more information about what the imbalance is about. And when I balance that, not only am I balancing that relationship, but because it still contains the whole, I'm also balancing the big picture. And that's really cool. And just to say a little bit more about the aspect of the amount of extra information you get, when I'm balancing, let's say, just stomach, well, the stomach, stomach is a major organ, does a lot of different stuff. It has a meridian that has 45 points on it. The organ itself has various anatomy and physiological aspects to it. It has several muscles that have full ranges of motion. It's a very kind of broad, undefined picture. When I find a reference meridian related to that, let's say gallbladder, then now I have a completely new data set to work off of. So if I'm thinking about physiology and I'm comparing stomach to gallbladder, now I can think about the fact, well, okay, I know that the gallbladder releases bile, and bile is important in fat digestion. And the stomach releases hydrochloric acid, and that acidity level, when it drops into the small intestine, creates a hormonal response that tells the gallbladder to go whoosh and spit the bile out. If it's not acidic enough, that doesn't happen. And so your digestive efficiency is compromised, and your fat digestion is compromised. And if that's specifically what's showing up for somebody, I can turn around and ask them something like, how do you feel after you eat fatty foods? And they go, yeah, not so great. How did you know that? So it gives me that extra level of depth of information to ask those kinds of questions and consider the type of the imbalance that's involved with the stomach, not just the whole stomach, but what more specifically might be going on. And it could, you know, as you know, in kinesiology, we look at it's a holistic approach. So maybe it's not a physiological thing. Maybe it's an emotional thing. And in the stomach relates to, you know, the 5 element system, sympathy and empathy. That could be a thing. But if I look at that relationship of sympathy and empathy to the emotions of the gallbladder being anger and rage, now I can ask the person, so how does sympathy and empathy relate to anger and rage for you? And you might get a completely different story, like, you know, yeah, well, you know, I'm always taking care of everybody else. I'm very sympathetic about other people's stuff, you know, but then when I need something, who pays attention to me? There's nobody ever around for me, and it really ticks me off. And so you get a deeper story out of it than if it was just the one emotion. My earpiece is telling me that it's dying. Just so you know.
Okay.
I have to switch to normal mic.
Sure. Go ahead and do that then.
You know, we'll take it out till it goes, and it'll just happen.
Sounds good. Okay. So what I'm hearing is that being able to look at, say, the muscle tests and the meridians in this way allows you to integrate more information and to see the relationships that help give structure and form to the kind of answers that you're getting through your muscle tests so that you know more specifically what's going on. Can you use this to integrate different modalities as well and to put them together in an interesting way?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So now when you get around to the balancing part, anything that's meridian based, you can apply holographically as well. So for instance, in Touch for Health, the first thing you might do is rub a neurolymphatic for the stomach. But now we're going to be rubbing the stomach neurolymphatic and the gallbladder neurolymphatic at the same time. So we're telling the body, this is the relationship that we're working on, and it's sending that healing information to the specific relationship. So it's much more focused and at the same time still addressing the whole, so it's also incredibly efficient. So you end up often needing to do less in order to achieve, you know, a full body balance. And even if you don't, you know, even if a modality isn't specifically meridian based, once you've established that relationship, then anything you do, you know, physical, nutritional, emotional, energetic, is still addressing the specific relationship that you've set up. So, you know, so that so that it's still working in that manner. And that's what makes it really unique. That's what makes Richard Utt's approach to this, excuse me, that's what makes Richard Utt's approach to this really unique, because he's the only guy that ever figured out how to take the concept of how a hologram actually works and apply it to the body in an assessment way, so that no matter what you do, you are still addressing this holographic relationship in the body. It's pretty cool.
It's very cool. There's a correction in the SIPS world called a meridian matrix correction, where you are, when I first learned it, I was taught that it was designed for you to find the meridian that needed the correction, and then to find, you know, which points along the meridian needed correction, and then to stimulate them in turn or simultaneously, right? So you would be working with, you know, a couple points on triple heater or something like that. But when I started working with it, what I was finding, and this is long before I had heard about any of the other work with holograms, what I started finding was that for me, it wasn't ever coming up like that. It was coming up that I needed to find 2 meridians, and hold points on each one, and that it was all about the relationship of those meridians. And I think other people must have also independently been finding that that was happening for them more and more, and telling Ian about it, because now it's more standard to teach it that way, actually, when we teach SIPS 1. And I really find that when it comes up to do that as a correction, it's so powerful. Even the kind of people who don't, they're not the energy feeling kind of people, you hit this specific point here and this point here, and it feels like spark plugs or jumper cables or something like that. The electricity just goes boom. And it's really fun to watch.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Touch for Health, right from the beginning, had the acupressure holding points. And same thing, you'd hold points, 2 points at a time. And, these points, to me, that's just about the most powerful technique in Touch for Health. And yet it's one of the most misunderstood and underutilized ones, at least in certain parts of the world. And it's incredibly powerful. And the Chinese were onto this whole aspect of, the hologram thousands of years ago. The command points, which are the points that are used in acupressure holding points, the command points by definition are the points on each meridian that relate that meridian to each of the other elements. And so right there's a relationship, and each meridian connects to each of the elements. So that means everything connects to everything. And so you can actually use the command points to access the hologram by, if you have, let's say, that relationship gallbladder we were talking about, then I would go to the wood element point on the stomach meridian and simply hold those points bilaterally. So that would be stomach 41, I think it is. Nope, stomach 43. And hold those points, and you're automatically connecting that relationship right up. And it's incredibly powerful. I've developed a couple of other techniques using emotions with that, and the points will actually tell you while you hold them what's going on, and whether you're onto something or not.
I really love that with the acupressure holding points, the idea that within each element, all the other elements are contained, right? And so it's not just that we're dealing with the fire element when we're working with this point, but that we can find the earth within the fire, or the wood within the fire, or it is a powerful idea, certainly.
Exactly. So, and this gets into, one of the things I've been working with the last few years a lot in any number of different ways, which is essentially this concept of the interconnectedness of all things. And there's many representations of that in the body, such as, the living matrix, the connective tissue, and how that actually connects down into every cell of the body and into the DNA level. And for my thinking, as below, so above, to reverse the usual way of looking at that, and so that if the living matrix connects down into the deepest level of every cell of the body, then there's a mechanism for which it also connects out of the body and connects into your etheric web, which is the metaphysical structure of the body, and out from there. And as part of the mechanism, as one mechanism of the interrelationship of all things.
Well, the little bit that I understand about HeartMath seems to kind of link into those concepts as well, right? So does HeartMath also get into all of that about the bigger picture hologram and the interconnectedness? Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sure. It's not so much through the holographic aspect of things, but just that the heart is the largest generator of electromagnetic field in the body, and the planet itself, our lovely planet Earth here, which we have a pretty nice shot of the idyllic nature of that behind you as we speak. planet Earth is a giant magnet. You know, it's got this big iron core, and it actually generates an electromagnetic field that extends hundreds of thousands of miles out into space. So that's pretty massive, and that's a good thing. It protects us from the solar radiation that otherwise would be bombarding our planet, and we would look a lot more like Mars without it. And our hearts, which actually resonate when in a coherent state, resonate at the same frequency as the planet, are the largest generator by far of an electromagnetic field in the body, extending several feet and probably more. We just don't have equipment sensitive enough to measure that yet. And that electromagnetic field is a carrier of information. And the information is the rhythm of your heart, and the rhythm of the heart is reflective of any number of different things going on in the body, including, very much so, your emotional state. And so your emotional state is affecting the rhythm of your heart and being carried and generated out into the field of the planet, interfacing with those in your immediate area, but then also getting onto the wings of the electromagnetic field of the planet, and yet another representation of the interconnectedness of all things, because you know, all living things have these kinds of properties. HeartMath is actually doing some very fun research now with trees, the interface between humans and trees, and the effect of that, and how trees communicate amongst each other, and all of that. It's really fascinating stuff.
That is very cool. Yeah. Are there any, I should have asked you this before, but I didn't think of it, so, you know, forgive me. Are there any resources, books, anything like that that you would suggest for people who were interested in this idea of the holograms? I mean, other than, of course, taking a class, that, you know, people could look at and find out more and start exploring?
Yeah, sure. You know, the classic is a book called The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And the first third of that book is probably the easiest to understand description of quantum physics that I've ever seen. It, you know, on the one hand, it's a little dated, but it's all the original and very valid stuff, and gets into all that. And it's great. You know, Michael Talbot originally was basically a sort of B-movie script writer and wrote like kind of odd books and stuff like that, science fiction stuff, and then suddenly came out with, you know, like 3 different books on the nature of the universe from this from the quantum physics perspective, and the holographic universe is, you know, probably the leading one of those, and is a great resource for this kind of stuff. And then the rest of the book goes on, and it, you know, basically is his vision of how that can be applied in any number of realms, including the healing arts. So that's, you know, that's always the #1 book to go for that. What else? Lately I've been reading books by Joseph Chilton Pierce, which are all pretty interesting, and include some HeartMath, but also extensive other philosophical backgrounds and concepts and things like that, and very much speak to the holographic nature of things.
All right, thank you.
The Heart-Brain Matrix, I believe, is the name of one of those books that gets into that.
Okay. Slightly off topic, but since I've got you, you know, like as a captive audience here anyway, can you tell
That being you.
Yeah, well, you know.
Yeah. No other captive audience I'd rather be speaking to.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Energy Kinesiology Awareness Council and how that came to be?
Sure, yeah. Well, the Energy Kinesiology Awareness Council is a nonprofit that I started back in the year 2000 with the idea of it being a means of, you know, well, the mission statement is to raise the awareness of the North American, that can be expanded to, you know, obviously internationally, the North American public to the benefits of energy kinesiology. And so the idea was to have that be a resource to help kind of bring together all the different kinesiology organizations at the time, to present a little bit of a sort of marketing PR face to it all, because, you know, that's never been a strong point for all of us. And
Really?
you've noticed that, huh? And so, you know, and I actually had the opportunity, and I mean, I've been blessed to, you know the originators of, you know, so many of the kinesiologies that created the foundation of the work that we have evolved from, you know, whether it's, you know, John B. and Touch for Health, and Gordon Stokes and Daniel Whitesides from the One Brain side, and just, I took workshops with George Goodhart and Sheldon Deal and Wally Schmidt and Victor Frank and Carl Ferrari, you know, and all those kinds of things. So I had the opportunity to kind of gather everybody together and pitch this, you know, idea of at least giving the concept of a unified front, even if various organizations really weren't wanting to integrate and work together so much. And as a means of just raising awareness to, you know, as a numbers game to bring people in, and then let them find, you know, filter off to wherever they were going to filter, so that we weren't working so much from such a poverty consciousness framework, because that was and still continues to be, unfortunately, the way things are. And so that was the idea, and everybody was into it and behind it. And then, you know, that was January and into the spring of 2000, and then the .com bubble burst, and everybody went into financial panic, and that kind of slowed the wheel down a bit. But the Awareness Council still exists. It has a website, awarenesscouncil.com. It's on Facebook. At one point, I was able to get enough funds together to create a little movie that a lot of people have seen and liked, and at the time played on all incoming flights internationally on United Airlines for a month. So that was kind of fun. It was done through some soap opera star who, you know, was doing her own little life and wellness cable TV show, and that's kind of how I was able to get this done. Recently, I've kind of brought the Awareness Council back to life, and so I'm hoping to make more of a presence of that. The mission is still needed, and it's still something I'm passionate about, and there are a number of different ways that it can present itself that I'm excited to be getting into. And so you're going to be hearing more about that soon. And our wonderful interviewer here is actually going to be a part of that too, because Alexis is now on the board of the Awareness Council. So something I very much appreciate.
Because I was looking at my schedule going, you know what, I need to get on another board. That's what I need to do.
Yes, because don't we just all love that?
But I believe in what you're talking about, and I believe in this idea that we do need to bring more attention. It kills me when I talk to people and I say that I've got a Touch for Health class coming up, and they go, "Oh, that sounds interesting. What's that?" I'm like, are you kidding me? This has been around for 50 years.
Right.
You know, that shouldn't be happening anymore, to my way of thinking. So, yeah, we're gonna.
Well, you know, new paradigms take a while to take hold. New models you know, it's all about models, and these things take time. And 50 years, the reality is there is still so much that's not understood really about muscle testing and the power of muscle testing and how it can be used. And, you know, it's still in its infancy. And so it's just a, you know, a matter of it surviving long enough for people to get it. But, you know, look, Copernicus got thrown in jail for saying that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. And it took 200 years for the whole planet to finally get behind that as a concept. So these things take time, and, you know, we just try and set up things in our lifetime to help to further the cause and hope that it carries on, and that the work carries on and the research continues and people ultimately figure out really how powerful this tool of muscle testing is.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. So we're kind of wrapping up here. Any kind of final thoughts about this idea of the holographic model of kinesiology, of muscle testing, of being able to look at these things from another level that you would like to leave people with as a final thought?
Yeah, you know, I think it's really important. You know, I've been using it for a long time, and I've learned, you know, I've taken thousands of hours of kinesiology workshops, and this is the model that I use the most. It's the one that's the base model. It's an open system that lets you still integrate everything else you learn, but when you apply it to a holographic model, you get much more efficient results, and you get way more information, and it just addresses things on a whole different level, where you're not only addressing the specifics and the individual, but also the whole of that person and beyond. And that's kind of the big piece that isn't really fully understood. And yeah, it's just one of it, you know, as in any other models like we were just talking about, these things take a while for people to really get and to catch on. And, you know, my hope is that by helping people to really understand it in sort of a deeper way, rather than just something you do, that will help it grow as a mode of working, really. And, you know, and that's how I teach. I teach in a way, you know, I one of the first things I do in any beginning class I teach, whether it's Touch for Health, Applied Physiology, Holographic Touch for Health, or whatever, is that, you know, I explain to people that, you know, these are classes not where you're just going to learn how to do this process, but you're going to learn how to think it. You're going to learn how to understand it, because when you can do that, it allows you to focus your intent in a way that very much deepens the results you get in the process that you're doing with the person that you're working with.
I couldn't agree more.
Alexis, I just want to thank you for you know, having me on to do the interview, and having this topic featured in the magazine. I just want to, you know, make note of all the work you're doing to promote kinesiology on a broad level, because I really appreciate that because you know, the more we can all do things to be inclusive rather than exclusive is what's really going to help kinesiology grow. And there's just been too much separateness, which is why, you know, part of my motivation for starting the Energy Kinesiology Awareness Council.
I just lost my earpiece. And so I just wanted to acknowledge you know, what you're doing in that realm, and that it's a really helpful and useful, well, it's just really helpful, useful work that you're doing. And so thanks for doing all that, and thanks for including me in.
Well, thank you. Now I'm all blushing.